What if I told you that the Bible isn't broken, but that it was actually never whole to begin with? What if the contradictions people avoid are actually the most honest parts of the entire book, revealing not divine perfection, but human fingerprints? Because for all its sacred status, the Bible can't seem to agree with itself on who God is, how salvation works, or even who carried the cross, and yet millions treat it as flawless. But when we put the text under honest scrutiny, not hostility, just clarity, we find something unavoidable. The Bible contradicts itself over and over again, and not just in minor details, but in its theology, ethics, and historical claims. This isn't about nitpicking typos or debating obscure laws. This is about examining the Bible the way believers say we should, as if it's true, perfect, and consistent. Spoiler alert, it's not. In this breakdown, we'll walk through some of the most significant contradictions in the Bible. Not the ones skeptics invented, but the ones your Bible prints side by side. Each one exposes something deeper: how biblical authors revised each other, how stories evolved over time, and how centuries of redaction shaped what billions now call the Word of God. Because if truth matters, and if the Bible makes truth claims, then the contradictions aren't just problems for critics, they're problems for believers too. So let's look at what the Bible actually says. Not what we were told, not what we hoped, but what's really written. The nature of God, seen or unseen. According to Exodus 33:11, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. According to John chapter 1, verse 18, no one has ever seen God. The contradiction here is, did people see God or not? According to the text, Moses did see God face to face, yet John says no one ever has. Now, theologians often try to attempt to reconcile this. They'll try to say things like, well, face to face is metaphorical, an anthropomorphism defense, if you will. This view argues that face to face doesn't mean literal visual contact. It's a metaphor for intimacy or direct communication. The problem here is the text explicitly compares it to how a man speaks to his friend. Just a few verses later, in Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, God says, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." So the same chapter contradicts itself. Well, another thing that they'll try to say is that Moses saw a limited manifestation of God. This is called the theophany defense. God can reveal parts of himself or show up in a form like a cloud, a fire, or angel without revealing his full divine essence. The problem here is that doesn't fix the contradiction in wording. John chapter 1, verse 18 says, no one has ever seen God, period. If Moses saw any part of God, John's blanket statement becomes false unless it's redefined into abstraction. Some people say John is referring only to God the Father, while Moses saw the Son or an angel. Some apologists argue Moses saw a pre-incarnate Christ or an angel standing in for God, while John 1:18 refers specifically to the unseen Father. The problem here is there is no indication in Exodus that Moses was speaking to an angel or Jesus. That interpretation is read back into the text retroactively from Christian doctrine. It also undermines the authority of the Torah's direct claims. And then there's also the progressive revelation argument. The Bible is a progressive revelation, and what appears as contradiction is actually a deepening of understanding. The problem here is that progressive revelation doesn't negate contradictions. It explains them away by treating older texts as less accurate or less clear, which undermines divine inspiration and inerrancy. So despite theological tap dancing, the contradiction remains. Exodus says Moses spoke to God face to face. John says no one ever has. No metaphor, angel, or philosophical nuance can fully collapse that gap unless you're already committed to harmonizing the text no matter what, which raises the deeper question. If the Bible can't agree on whether anyone has seen God, how can it claim to be perfectly inspired? Who killed Goliath? 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 50 says David kills Goliath. 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19 says Elhanan killed Goliath. The contradiction here is two different people are credited with killing the same giant. Now, some translations try to smooth this out, but the Hebrew is absolutely clear. Let's read this text as it's written. 1 Samuel 17 says, "So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. He killed him." Clear claim here. David kills Goliath. But then in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, in another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, the son of Jorah-Oregim the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. There's a clear claim here. Elhanan killed Goliath. Now, in the original Hebrew, the name Goliath is explicit. There's no ambiguity here. But let's talk about how theologians try to reconcile this one. Some say it was a different Goliath. Some claim that there may have been two giants named Goliath, and Elhanan killed the second one. The problem here is that there's no evidence in the text that Goliath was a common name. The description in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, is identical to the description of the Goliath David supposedly killed. Other people say Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. This is the explanation most English Bibles now adopt. 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 5, written later, says Elhanan killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. The problem here is that 1 Chronicles was written later, and it clearly alters the story to fix the contradiction. The original wording in 2 Samuel 21, verse 19, makes no mention of a brother. It simply says Elhanan killed Goliath. Modern Bibles like the New International Version even insert the phrase the brother of into 2 Samuel 21 in italics or brackets, despite the fact that it doesn't appear in the Hebrew. That's not interpretation. That's editing the Bible to make it agree with itself when it doesn't. Some even say Elhanan helped David or struck the fatal blow. Some suggest Elhanan assisted in the battle or dealt the final blow after David weakened Goliath. The problem here is that's nowhere in the text. It's a theological invention. Both verses clearly attribute the kill to one person, not a team effort. Now, why does this contradiction matter? This isn't a matter of poetic language or theological nuance. It's a historical contradiction. Two different people are credited with killing the same legendary enemy using the same description of his weapon in the same Philistine war context. If the Bible can't keep its heroes and their victory straight, how can it be trusted as a perfect historical or divine record? And if later authors felt compelled to correct the Bible, then the idea of divine preservation and inerrancy collapses. Now, this third one that I want to highlight is, can God change his mind? According to Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, God is not a man that he should lie or change his mind. But according to Jonah chapter 3, verse 10, God changed his mind and did not destroy Nineveh. Now, Exodus chapter 32, verse 14 says, so the Lord changed his mind. Now, this is a clear contradiction, and the question is this immutable or reactive? Now again, Numbers chapter 23 says, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. There is a clear claim there that God does not change his mind. And then in Jonah chapter 3, verse 10, it says, when God saw what they did, he changed his mind about the calamity he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. The clear claim here is that God changed his mind based on human behavior. And then even when we look back at Exodus 32, so the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on his people. Again, God changed his mind after Moses argued with him. One verse says God never changes his mind. Two others show him clearly doing just that, and we haven't even started digging yet. So how do theologians try to reconcile this one? Some say God only appeared to change his mind. I'm very familiar with this one. Some argue that from the human perspective, it looked like God changed his mind, but it was actually part of his unchanging plan all along. The problem with this is theological gymnastics. Redefining changed his mind to mean revealed a different part of his plan. The text says explicitly that God changed, not that humans misunderstood. Another defense that people give is the anthropomorphism defense. God changed his mind is just figurative language, a way to help humans relate to divine action. The problem here is that if this is figurative, then so is any part of the Bible. It opens the door for arbitrary reinterpretation of any divine attribute. Also, Numbers 23:19 is presented as a definitive theological statement, not metaphor. And then some will say contextual interpretation. In Jonah and Exodus, the change of mind was a response to repentance, not a true change in God's character or plan. The problem here is that's still a change in intention and action, which is the very thing Numbers 23:19 says God doesn't do. It's a functional contradiction between immutability and responsiveness. This contradiction reveals two competing concepts of God in the biblical tradition: a philosophical God, unchanging, omniscient, transcendent, mostly in post-exilic or Hellenistic texts, and then a narrative God, responsive, emotional, and relational, common in early Hebrew storytelling. This isn't just a textual inconsistency, it's evidence that the idea of God evolved over time, shaped by different authors, agendas, and cultural shifts, immutable or reactive. The Bible says both, which means it cannot consistently say either. This next one: who incited David to take a census? 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1 says God incited David. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 1, it says Satan incited David. So was it God or was it Satan? Let's take a closer look. 2 Samuel 24. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against him, saying, "Go number Israel and Judah." The claim is clear here. God was angry, and God incited David to take the census. Now let's look at 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Clear claim, Satan is now blamed for the same act. The same event is attributed to two entirely different beings, God in one, Satan in the other. Let's talk about how theologians try to reconcile this one. Some say God allowed Satan to do it. So some claim both verses are true. Satan did it, but under God's permission, similar to Job. Problem? 2 Samuel doesn't say God allowed it, it says God did it. This defense is an attempt to harmonize irreconcilable agency without textual support. Also, in the book of Job, Satan is explicitly present and identified. In 2 Samuel, he's not mentioned at all. Another one that people use is that Satan equals adversary, not devil. Some scholars argue that Satan in Hebrew just means adversary or opponent, and may not refer to the devil as later defined. The problem is that even if Satan is a generic adversary, it's still not God, meaning the agency still changes between the two accounts. Chronicles was written later at a time when the idea of Satan as a moral opposite to God was developing, which suggests intentional redirection. Other people go the sovereignty defense. God's sovereignty includes evil acts. Some try to thread the needle by saying God ultimately ordained it, but Satan executed it, part of a divine testing. The problem here is that this is imported theology not found in either passage. The verse doesn't share the same language, tone, or attribution. It also contradicts the moral argument in James 1:13, which says God tempts no one. This isn't just a conflict of names, it's a theological evolution in real time. 2 Samuel reflects an earlier theology where God is the source of both good and evil. You can take a look at Isaiah 45 for that. But 1 Chronicles, written much later, reflects a shift where evil must be distanced from God and assigned to a developing figure, Satan. The contradiction reveals an uncomfortable truth. Biblical theology is not consistent. It develops, corrects, and reframes itself, which means the Bible isn't a unified message from a single divine mind. It's a patchwork of human attempts to make sense of power, justice, and morality, often at odds with each other. How many animals were on the ark? Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 through 20 says 2 of every kind. But Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 through 3 suggests 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 of unclean. Contradiction: how many of each were there? Let's take a closer look. Genesis chapter 6, starting at verse 19, says, "You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal." Clear instructions. 2 of every kind, 1 male, 1 female, no mention of clean versus unclean animals at all. But when we get to Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 through 3, and mind you, this is just 1 chapter later, which seems to be a pattern in the book of Genesis. It says, "Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird." Now we have 7 pairs of clean animals, 14 total of each, 1 pair of unclean animals, 2 total of each, 7 pairs of birds. Now, Genesis 6 says 2 of every kind. Genesis 7 modifies that to include 7 pairs of clean animals and birds without explaining the change. Let's talk about how theologians try to reconcile it. Now, some say Genesis 6 gave the general rule, Genesis 7 gave more detail. Some argue Genesis 6 was a broad summary, while Genesis 7 is a more specific clarification. The problem is that might work if Genesis 6 didn't sound like explicit instruction. It's not a summary. It's God giving Noah commands. There's no transition like, here are some additional instructions. The story just shifts without explanation. Others say the number 2 still applies to unclean animals. Some claim the text is consistent because it's 2 of the unclean and 7 pairs of the clean, so both are technically true. Problem, again, Genesis 6 makes no distinction between clean and unclean. The idea of clean animals doesn't even get introduced until later in the Torah, Leviticus, so Noah shouldn't know what's clean or unclean in this part of the story. Some people say it's just a translation issue. Some claim 7 may refer to 7 individuals, not pairs. Well, the problem here is that Genesis 7:2 says 7 pairs or 7 each male and its mate, not just 7 animals. That makes it 14 clean animals per kind, not just 7 or 2. This contradiction exposes that the Noah story is a composite text, 2 flood accounts spliced together by later redactors. Genesis 6 aligns with the Yahweh source, J, which emphasizes simple obedience in 2 of every kind. But Genesis 7 reflects the priestly source, P, concerned with ritual purity and later sacrificial laws, hence the distinction between clean and unclean animals. This isn't one story, it's 2 traditions woven together. The contradiction isn't a flaw in reading, it's a fingerprint of human editing. And if the story's internal logistics don't match, how can it be taken as a literal, perfect account? How did Judas die? Matthew chapter 27, verse 5 says he hanged himself. But Acts chapter 1, verse 18 says he fell headlong, burst open, and his intestines spilled out. The contradiction here is that it's 2 completely different causes of death. Let's take a closer look. Matthew 27:5 says, "So Judas threw the silver into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself." There's a clear claim here. Judas committed suicide by hanging. But when we take a look at Acts chapter 1, it says, "With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out." The claim here is that Judas fell and suffered a violent bodily rupture. These are not compatible. One is a controlled hanging, the other is a gruesome fall resulting in bodily explosion. Let's talk about how theologians try to reconcile this one. Some say he hanged himself, then fell. This was one of the first ones that I remember hearing. This is the most common apologetic. Judas hanged himself, the rope eventually broke, or the branch did, and his body fell and burst open. The problem with this is there is no textual evidence for this combo death in either passage. Matthew says nothing about falling. Acts says nothing about a hanging. This merged version is invented to harmonize a contradiction that the text itself does not attempt to resolve. Some say Luke was being figurative in Acts. Some argue that the falling and bursting is a metaphor, perhaps describing deep shame or spiritual corruption. The problem here is there's no indication in Acts that the language is symbolic. The description is graphic and literal. Falling, bursting, intestines. This is not poetic language, it's forensic. Others say that it could be 2 different traditions. Some admit the contradiction, claiming Matthew and Acts reflect different oral traditions about Judas's death. The problem is, while this is the most honest scholarly answer, it directly undermines the idea that the Bible is a single, perfect, divinely inspired account. You can't have inerrancy and multiple contradictory oral traditions in the same canon. This isn't just a detail like how many angels were at the tomb. It's about the violent end of one of the most infamous figures in the New Testament, told in 2 completely different ways. Matthew, Judas dies alone in guilt and remorse, hanging himself after returning the money. In Acts, Judas dies after acquiring the field using the money, and his death is so violent in public that the field becomes known as the field of blood. These versions reflect 2 incompatible theological narratives. Matthew paints Judas as a tragic figure who feels regret. Acts rewrites the story to emphasize betrayal, punishment, and divine justice. If the Bible can agree on how Judas, a central figure in the crucifixion story, died, then it's not a unified or flawless account. It's a patchwork of perspectives, each with its own agenda. So much for the idea of the Gospels being written by eyewitnesses, huh? Who carried Jesus' cross? John chapter 19, verse 17, Jesus carried it himself. But in Mark 15:21, Simon of Cyrene carried it for him. The contradiction, who bore the burden? Let's take a closer look. John chapter 19, verse 17 says, carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Clear claim here is that Jesus carried his own cross. But when we look at Mark chapter 15, verse 21, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. The clear claim here is that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross, not Jesus. Did Jesus carry it himself, or did someone else do it? The text does not say both. They describe mutually exclusive scenarios. So let's talk about how theologians try to reconcile this one. Some say Jesus started, then Simon finished. And yes, there are jokes there. The most common harmonization is that Jesus began carrying the cross, but due to exhaustion, Simon was recruited to carry it the rest of the way. The problem is that John doesn't say Jesus started carrying it. He says Jesus carried it, period. Mark doesn't say Jesus carried it at all. Only Simon is mentioned. Luke and Matthew also support Simon carrying it, not Jesus. This is not a combined story. It's a replacement. This harmonization is not in the text. It's a theological mashup to avoid admitting inconsistency. Some people say different emphasis for different audiences. John emphasizes Jesus' strength and intentional sacrifice. The synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, focus on his suffering and human weakness. The problem is that may explain why they differ, but it doesn't eliminate the contradiction. If inspiration and inerrancy were true, we'd expect complementarity, not contradiction. And then some will say that it's symbolic, not literal. Some argue John's account is theological, portraying Jesus carrying his cross as symbolic of bearing the sin of the world. The problem is that might justify John's choice as literary theology, but it doesn't fix the factual inconsistency. Either Jesus carried the cross or he didn't. Both can't be literally true. This isn't just a side detail. It's a core visual of Christian tradition immortalized in art, film, and doctrine. The image of Jesus carrying his own cross is central to the passion narrative, evoking his strength and sacrifice. The image of Simon of Cyrene carrying it adds a dimension of human assistance and shared suffering. But the Gospels don't blend these ideas. They choose one or the other. This contradiction shows that the Gospel writers were not eyewitnesses reciting the same event. They were storytellers shaping theology, not historians preserving perfect fact. So who carried the cross? If you believe John, it was Jesus. If you believe Mark, Matthew, and Luke, it was Simon. You have to pick one or admit what's becoming clearer. The Bible is not one voice. It's a chorus of contradictions. Salvation. Is it by faith alone or works too? Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9 says, by grace, not by works. James chapter 2, verse 24 says a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. The contradiction here is faith alone versus faith plus works. Let's take a closer look. We'll start with Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, and we'll just call this Pauline theology. He says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. The clear claim is that salvation is by faith alone, not earned by actions or good deeds. But James chapter 2, verses 24, which would be non-Pauline theology, he says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. There's a clear claim here. Salvation includes works. Faith alone is insufficient. These are directly contradictory statements. One says not by works, the other says not by faith alone. Let's take a look at how theologians try to reconcile this one. Some say it's different kinds of works. Some say Paul was condemning legalistic works like circumcision and Mosaic law, while James was talking about ethical works like caring for the poor. The problem is that's not what the text says. Neither Paul nor James defines works narrowly. James literally uses Abraham and Rahab as examples of righteous acts validating faith. Paul uses Abraham too, but in the opposite direction. In Romans chapter 4, verses 2 through 5, saying he was justified before doing any works. Others say James is talking about proof of faith, not salvation. Apologists argue that James isn't saying works save you, only that works prove real faith. The problem is that James explicitly says, can such faith save them? And answers no. He's not talking about proving salvation. He's saying faith without works is dead and doesn't justify. The phrase not by faith alone is a direct rebuttal to Paul's position. Some say that Paul and James are complementary. Some claim the two writers are addressing different audiences and contexts, one combating legalism, the other complacency. Again, the problem here is if divine inspiration can't present a coherent message on how to be saved, it's not a communication issue, it's a doctrinal fracture. You can't be saved without works and also be saved only with works. This isn't just a nuance in tone or emphasis, it's a doctrinal war inside the New Testament. Paul, in Ephesians, Romans, and Galatians, salvation is by faith, not of works. But according to James, faith without works is dead. Works are required for justification, and the tension isn't accidental. The early church had multiple theological camps trying to define salvation. Paul's letters emphasize grace and inward belief. James and some of Jesus' teachings in the Synoptics emphasize action, behavior, and ethical responsibility. The contradiction isn't just inconvenient, it's central to Christian identity. That's why entire denominations split over it. The bottom line, Ephesians says faith alone, not works. James says not faith alone, works are required. These ideas cannot both be the true formula for salvation. Either God is unclear or the Bible is not unified. Contradictions in any book would be worth noting. But when the book is said to be divinely inspired, perfectly preserved, and morally binding, then contradictions aren't just editorial errors. They are cracks in the foundation. Each contradiction we've explored, whether about who saw God, who killed Goliath, or how salvation works, pulls the thread on the claim of biblical inerrancy. And when enough threads unravel, the whole tapestry starts to look less divine and more human. But that's not a bad thing. In fact, it might be the most liberating realization of all. Because if the Bible is not perfect, then you're allowed to question it. If it's not inerrant, then you don't need to fear it. And if it evolved over time, shaped by authors, editors, and empires, then maybe so can we. Letting go of biblical perfection doesn't mean abandoning meaning. It means reclaiming your authority to interpret, to question, and to grow. It means we can talk about morality without ancient genocide. We can seek truth without needing it wrapped in prophecy. We can build community without the fear of divine punishment or reward. And perhaps most importantly, we can treat the Bible not as a rule book from heaven, but as a record of human longing, contradiction, and imagination. We don't need perfect texts. We need honest ones. We need brave communities willing to wrestle, rethink, and build beyond superstition. Because what's sacred isn't the scroll. It's the struggle to understand. It's the courage to evolve. It's the human capacity to create meaning, even when the gods go silent. So read critically, think deeply, ask everything, and remember, a truth that can't survive a contradiction wasn't truth to begin with. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation today. Thank you for hanging out with me. If you're looking for more talks like this, check out the other videos on the screen. Until next time, keep rising.